Imagine waking up tomorrow and finding that every single human being on Earth except you has simply vanished. No explanation, no warning, just silence. Cities standing empty. Cars stopped in the middle of highways. Phones ringing with no one left to answer them. Now, push that thought even further and remove yourself from the equation too. Imagine every human on the planet disappearing at once, leaving Earth completely empty of people, but everything else, every building, every machine, every animal, left exactly as it was. What would actually happen to the world you leave behind? And how long would it take before every trace of human civilization disappeared along with you? The very first thing that would happen has nothing to do with buildings or nature. It has to do with electricity. Within hours of every human disappearing, power grids around the world would begin failing. Most electricity is generated by power plants that require constant human oversight, whether that means feeding fuel into a system, monitoring nuclear reactors, or maintaining hydroelectric dams. Without anyone left to manage these systems, backup generators would kick in for a short while, but once their fuel ran out, usually within a day or two, the lights would go out permanently almost everywhere on the planet. Cities that have never experienced true darkness in over a century would fall into complete blackness within about 48 hours. Nuclear power plants present one of the most immediate concerns in this scenario. Modern nuclear reactors are designed with automatic shutdown systems that engage when they detect a lack of human input, and most would successfully power down into a safe state without a meltdown. However, the spent fuel rods stored in cooling pools at these facilities require active water circulation for years to prevent overheating. Without workers to maintain these systems, some of these cooling pools could eventually boil dry, releasing radioactive steam and creating localized contamination zones around dozens of nuclear facilities worldwide within just a few years of human disappearance. As electricity fails, so does most of the technology you depend on every single day. Water treatment plants would stop functioning almost immediately, meaning any water still flowing from taps would quickly become undrinkable. Subway systems in cities like New York and London would begin flooding within days, since these underground tunnels require constant pumping to keep groundwater out, a task that has been performed around the clock by human engineers since the day these systems were built. Without that pumping, entire subway networks would be completely submerged within about 36 hours. Now shift your attention to the buildings themselves, because nature would begin reclaiming human structures far faster than you might expect. Within the first year, untended lawns, parks, and gardens would grow wild. Cracks would begin appearing in poorly maintained roads as weeds pushed their way through asphalt, and gutters clogged with leaves would cause water damage to begin creeping into homes and office buildings. By year 5, many wooden structures would already show significant decay. Roofs would begin collapsing in buildings without proper drainage, and asphalt roads in colder climates would be severely cracked and broken apart by repeated freeze and thaw cycles, with no one left to perform maintenance or repairs. Within 20 to 25 years, most suburban homes would be structurally unsound, with roofs caving in and interiors exposed to weather, allowing plants and animals to move in and accelerate the decay even further. Steel bridges would begin to weaken as protective coatings wore away and rust set in unchecked, though many of the strongest bridges and skyscrapers, engineered with significant safety margins, would likely remain partially standing for 50 to 100 years or more before serious structural failure occurred. One of the most fascinating parts of this scenario involves what would happen to major cities built directly on top of extensive underground infrastructure. And there is no better example than New York City. Manhattan sits on a network of subway tunnels and building foundations that are only kept dry today because pumps are actively working around the clock to remove groundwater. Once those pumps stop, experts estimate it would take only about 36 hours for subway tunnels to begin flooding significantly, and within 20 years, the foundations of many skyscrapers would be undermined by water erosion and shifting soil, potentially causing certain buildings to lean, crack, or even collapse decades earlier than they otherwise would have. While human structures are decaying, the natural world would be experiencing an almost immediate and dramatic recovery. Air pollution levels, particularly in major cities, would drop noticeably within just a few weeks, since the vast majority of air pollution comes directly from vehicles, factories, and power plants that would all cease operating almost immediately. Within a few years, waterways that had been polluted for decades by industrial runoff and urban wastewater would begin to show measurable improvements in water quality, and fish populations in many rivers and coastal areas would begin to rebound as chemical pollution levels dropped. Animal populations would respond in dramatically different ways depending on how dependent they had become on humans. Wild animals that had been pushed to the margins of cities and towns would begin reclaiming urban spaces almost immediately, with deer, foxes, and various bird species likely to be seen wandering through empty streets and abandoned parking lots within the very first few months. However, many domesticated animals would face a much harsher reality. Pets like dogs and cats left behind would need to survive on their own instincts, and while some would successfully adapt to a feral lifestyle, scavenging and hunting to survive, many would struggle significantly in the first weeks without human care, especially animals bred for companionship rather than survival skills. Farm animals would face perhaps the most difficult transition, since many modern livestock breeds have been selectively bred over generations to depend heavily on human management for feeding, healthcare, and protection from predators, meaning large numbers of farm animals would likely not survive the first year without human intervention. Consider also what would happen to Earth's atmosphere and climate on a longer timescale. With human industrial activity completely halted, greenhouse gas emissions from factories, vehicles, and power plants would stop entirely and immediately. However, the carbon dioxide already present in the atmosphere from centuries of human activity would not disappear overnight, since natural carbon absorption processes through oceans and forests operate on timescales of decades to centuries. Scientists estimate that atmospheric carbon dioxide levels could take anywhere from several decades to over a century to return to levels seen before the Industrial Revolution, meaning the climate effects of human civilization would continue to be felt long after every trace of humanity's physical presence had vanished from the landscape. Within 100 years, the transformation of the planet would be almost unrecognizable in many areas. Most wooden houses would have completely collapsed and been overtaken by forest growth. Roads would be cracked beyond recognition, broken apart by decades of tree roots and weather cycles, essentially disappearing beneath encroaching vegetation in many regions. Steel structures without ongoing maintenance would have rusted significantly, and while some skyscrapers might remain partially standing, their windows would almost certainly be shattered, allowing rain, wind, and plant life to invade their interiors completely. Move forward to 500 years after human disappearance, and most evidence of everyday human life would be gone entirely. Wood, paper, and most plastics would have decomposed or been broken down by natural processes, weather, and organic decay. Most buildings, even well-engineered concrete structures, would have crumbled significantly, with only the most massive stone monuments, similar to ancient structures like the pyramids of Egypt that have already survived thousands of years, likely to remain standing in any recognizable form. Perhaps the most enduring evidence of human civilization would not be visible at all from the surface. Deep geological deposits, satellites still drifting silently in orbit long after their power sources failed, and certain extremely stable radioactive materials would persist for thousands or even tens of thousands of years, creating a faint but permanent geological signature of human civilization's brief but intense presence on the planet. Some scientists have suggested that future geologists, if any such observers ever existed, might eventually classify this thin layer of human impact as a distinct marker in Earth's geological record, evidence of a species that dramatically altered the planet's chemistry, biodiversity, and landscape in an evolutionary blink of an eye before disappearing almost as suddenly as it arrived. What makes this scenario so captivating is not simply imagining empty cities or collapsing buildings, but recognizing just how much active, continuous human effort goes into maintaining the modern world you take for granted every single day. Every pumped basement, every maintained bridge, every managed power grid, and every carefully bred farm animal depends entirely on constant human attention and labor. Remove that attention, even for a relatively short period of time on a geological scale, and the physical evidence of human civilization would begin vanishing almost immediately, with nature reclaiming the planet far faster and far more completely than most people ever imagine, until eventually, given enough time, the Earth would look almost exactly as it did before humans ever existed at all.